All right, everybody. This is going to be my last set of notes on the Renaissance period. Again, I'm still using this header every time, so you know it's all under one unit, but we're still talking about the Renaissance. Hopefully you had a chance to look at kind of the painters and paintings and be able to get some understanding of those in a little bit greater detail as well. Again, if you have questions about any of the stuff here, send me an email. I'll try to help you with kind of getting answers to some of your questions as we still kind of plow through this time period. So we've looked at the painters of this era, the Da Vinci's, Michelangelo's, Raphael's, Van Eyck, Durer, um, Botticelli's, etc., and their significance and how they used painting to frame the new Renaissance view on individuality and humanity, which goes back to that general idea of humanism, which we're going to examine a little bit more here today. So let's move on from that and kind of get right to it. All right. I don't know why those all came up, but whatever. So um, let's talk a little bit about Renaissance education. So during the Renaissance, education becomes kind of something that is important again. As education becomes available for more people, it's something that folks in the Renaissance really move towards because, again, supporting that idea of humanism and the importance of the individual, the opportunities for education that are becoming more and more important at this time. Remember, after the fall of the Roman Empire, the world took many steps backward. Literacy rates went down. People were less able to communicate with one another. Problems like that. We're now in the Renaissance, finally moving beyond that point where we were at the height of the Roman Empire, where we've taken over 1,000 years to kind of get back to this point. Okay, so what we see here is kind of the beginnings of that's not a good color. What we see is kind of the beginnings of modern education. Okay, in terms of different subject matters being taught and stuff of that nature. Okay, so we're talking about subjects like history, rhetoric. We talked about rhetoric before. It's just essentially speaking in public, giving and discussing different ideas and things like that. What else is taught? Um, Philosophy, math, and astronomy is really popular. Music, poetry, classes on persuasion. The art of persuasion, being able to persuade people to believe something or other. Believe it or not, gym became important. People during the Renaissance believed that a strong mind, part of a strong mind is a healthy human body. So that was something of great importance as well. Okay, so again, a lot of these elements of education that we're familiar with today, that we have today, um, were begin during this time, right? We all take gym classes today. Uh, your English classes are kind of like what rhetoric classes would have been back then. Math, obviously, history, religion, your music classes and things of that nature. Okay, so we're seeing again just the rebirth and regrowth of education. Okay, this education that people were getting was also very, very focused on the humanities. Okay, the humanities again from that root word of humanism, the belief that every individual is important, people are important. Humanities education basically consists of courses in, like, again, um, philosophy, rhetoric, history, religion, um, language, things of that nature. A humanities education does not include classes like math and science. Those are more, I guess, theoretical or more, fact-based type things that are a little bit less the focus of the Renaissance era. People still weren't ready to challenge religion and things like that in ways that, you know, investigating science would probably do. Much of what people believe is largely based off of the ancient Greeks and Romans. We're still operating in a time period where Plato and Aristotle are the basis for much of our understanding of science and math during this time. So we see that the beliefs of them of the Greek philosophers are still what guides a lot of our thinking during this time. But they're also being rediscovered during this era, and their ideas kind of looked into and challenged a little bit more in different ways. But people still aren't ready to really move beyond the basic understandings that they have of math and science, right? That'll come in the next century or so, okay? Including some of the painters we talked about that were also mathematicians, okay? So how does education work during this time, right? Men particularly are, wanting to take these classes on rhetoric and persuasion. They need to be able to speak well. Understanding history is big. Understanding the political climate is big. So they learn about all that. Women, education was also stressed for women, but a little bit differently. For instance, philosophy was something that men would be taught very regularly during the Renaissance, but not women. Why would women not be taught philosophy? Why do you think? Think about that for a second. Because, no hands, I don't see any hands up. Because philosophy encourages people to think for themselves and think about new ideas and things like that. We still don't want women to do this. We still don't want women to think for themselves and try to step outside what societal expectations for women exist during that time. So philosophy is very discouraged for women, but what is encouraged more instead of philosophy is classes on religion. Okay, religion is very much stressed for females during this time, because as the chief homemakers at home and the raisers of the family, it was very important that women raise their children with good Christian moral values. Therefore, replacing philosophy largely for women is more of a focus on religion, because in teaching religion, they're going to teach their children to be good with good Christian morals, etc. So religion is very highly stressed for female education during that time. Now, again, not all women are getting an education, but those that are going to focus on these things. All right, moving on. Okay, I don't know why these slides come up in full, but I'll have to work on that. If you have any questions over that first slide, please let me know. Here on this one, it's pretty simple. We start to see a more organized class system start to kind of take form during the during the Renaissance, where we see kind of like a four-tier class system kind of emerge, where above everybody else, still holding a great deal of influence and power, is clergy. But kind of tied in with them is the nobility, the middle class, the bourgeoisie. That's a terrible M. The middle class is represented by the bourgeoisie, and then the largest class of people is the commoners. Okay, this is largely based off the system that existed in France, the Estates Generales that we talked about at the end of the Middle Ages there. But you have the clergy and nobility. At once were separate classes, but as time went on, they would kind of merge more closely in terms of their relationship. In the middle class, you have the bourgeois, which they're also going to grow in significance and role and influence over time. And then you have commoners, who are just kind of sit still, and as the groups ahead of them move further away, that's going to make that gap between them and everybody else a little bit greater, which is going to ultimately lead to revolution in France and Russia and all that stuff. But that is much, much later on. So we'll get to that when we get to that. Okay, so moving on from that is our last slide of the Renaissance. I want you to listen closely as we kind of talk about these folks here. Some of the most important figures, non-artistic figures of the Renaissance. First is Niccolo Machiavelli. Okay, Machiavelli writes a famous book called The Prince. Writes a famous book called The Prince. Prince. Okay, The Prince is essentially a book about political power. Okay, and said how the old ideas of political power and influence are based on Christian morals, right? Your Christian morals should drive your rule and your leadership, kind of like a Charlemagne or somebody of that nature. At least that's who they used as an example in many cases. Um, Machiavelli says, forget about all that. It needs to be rejected. Okay, forget about your morals, and it's important for leaders to instead act on behalf of the state. In other words, the actions that you take, uh, you know, sometimes the moral decision is not the right thing to make for your country or your people at a particular time. So you need to set that aside to do something instead that's going to be for the benefit of the state, right? For instance, morally, you may be, say, you're president of the United States, morally, you may be against war, but your country gets attacked by a foreign power, and you need to act on the behalf of half of the state by responding to that with force against that country. A good example of something Machiavellian in that respect would be looking at Harry Truman, right? Harry Truman probably doesn't want to kill hundreds of thousands of Japanese by dropping an atomic bomb, two atomic bombs on them, but he looked at it and said, well, either we continue fighting and we see a lot more Americans die, or we do this and swiftly end the war, right? It's a difficult decision, and it's one that certainly has been debated ever since. But it's a Machiavelli decision in the sense that he's acting on behalf of what's best for the state, even though his personal feelings may be against such an idea. Okay, so that's Machiavelli. That's him right here. Another important writer from this time, another important Italian writer, is Dante Alighieri. Dante Alighieri writes a book called The Divine Comedy. The Divine Comedy. Write that down. Make sure you understand that. There's an image from the Divine Comedy right here. What the Divine Comedy is about is Dante's journey through hell, purgatory, and ultimately paradise, as he calls it, or heaven. It's a book really about man's journey to salvation, right? Man's journey to salvation is what the book is about. Really, Dante's personal journey to salvation. It's a book written of his images and understandings of the world around him, and this mystical world of faith in the late Middle Ages, in the late Middle Ages period and into the Renaissance era. This is a book that really goes a long way in helping people understand their perceptions of faith and their vision of heaven and hell and what that might mean to folks. So it's a really important story. It's a really important story for its time and becomes really the viewpoint that a lot of people have about faith and about heaven and hell and purgatory during this era. Okay, Geoffrey Chaucer. Chaucer writes a famous book in the 1300s. There's an image of the cover of that book right here. It's called The Canterbury Tales. I'm not even going to try to write it there. It's called The Canterbury Tales. Canterbury Tales. Tales, right? It's basically a satire, kind of a satire novel that talks a little bit about the church in England during this time, but most notably talking about stories about regular everyday people. Most writing that existed prior to the Renaissance was all about important people, kings, emperors, generals, people of that nature, or fictional heroes like gods and things like that. Chaucer's book, The Canterbury Tales, is largely stories about regular everyday people and how they experience life. Chaucer was kind of basically he had a job, kind of was like a collector in the sense that he would deal with people from all kinds of different backgrounds. So he writes this book talking about different people like a baker or a knight or a plowman, somebody that pushes a plow like a regular farmer or something like that, or a butcher, somebody that cuts up meat, right? And basically talks about their experiences. They share stories about things that involve their lives. This is a really groundbreaking story because it's kind of the first time where we examine the lives of regular people in the world rather than just people that are important and famous. So that's a really important novel. William Shakespeare, pictured here, is probably somebody that you know as well. Shakespeare is a great example of how people kind of understand the world around them in the Renaissance period, especially in England. Okay, his plays help us understand history better, help us understand the world that we were living in that time a little bit better. Okay, Shakespeare's plays are basically broken down into three separate types. There are comedies, tragedies, and then history plays. Shakespeare wrote a lot of history plays. Some examples of some famous comedies by Shakespeare. Write these down too. He writes three types of plays: comedies, tragedies, histories. Examples of some comedies would be stories like The Tempest, Tempest, Twelfth Night, The Taming of the Shrew. A Midsummer Night's Dream is a comedy. I think you do that one in middle school. So again, The Tempest, Twelfth Night, The Taming of the Shrew, Shrew, A Midsummer Night's Dream. Those are examples of Shakespearean comedies. Tragedies are probably something you're a little bit more familiar with. Stories like Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy. Hamlet is a tragedy. Macbeth is a tragedy. Julius Caesar is kind of a tragedy, but it's also kind of a historical play. Shakespeare wrote a lot of plays about kings and monarchs during his time, like Richard III, which we learned about last unit, a lot of other kings, King John, the guy from the Magna Carta, Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, people like that. So a lot of our knowledge of history and our interest of history comes from the tales and the writings of William Shakespeare and how he impressed upon us an interest in kind of some of these important moments from our history. So three types of plays: comedies, tragedies, and histories. Histories like Richard III, Richard II, Henry V, Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, etc., etc. So you see all that. Finally, the last important person I didn't picture him here is Johannes Gutenberg, who created the printing press. Printing press is going to be a big, big deal. The printing press is going to change the world. Yikes. Printing press is going to change the world that we live in. Okay. Why is the printing press so important? Because suddenly now, rather than having monks or people like that kind of rewrite everything that people are going to read, people are going to see, now instead we have the ability to mass produce, at least get to the point where we can produce in greater number books and stories. And what book do you think is the one that is the very first book to be produced off the printing press? What do you think? The Gutenberg Bible, right? The Bible, of course, is the first one. That's the most important book to people. Certainly the Renaissance and any time thereafter, being able to mass produce, or at least produce in greater number, books, writings, and stories increases the literacy rate, increases people's desire for education and learning, changes again the world around us even more as we head into the next period we're going to talk about here the next couple of days, which is the Protestant Reformation. I'm going to shut things down there, folks. Again, hopefully I can start making some of these videos just a little bit shorter. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I will talk to you tomorrow later on.